John Stuart Mill was the outstanding British philosopher of the 19th century. He was a precocious genius. His father was also a philosopher. And he was raised on a very strict diet of the classics, of mathematics, of foreign languages, and was probably one of the best educated teenagers of his time. But he was so pressured that he had a nervous breakdown around the age of 20. And that got him to thinking about the importance of human life, about the importance of happiness. And his philosophy is in many ways geared to an appreciation of these insights. As a philosopher, Mill belongs to the long tradition of British empiricism, along with John Locke, Bishop Berkeley, David Hume. In many ways, he was the most thoroughgoing of all of them. In fact, he took his logic, which was one of the most outstanding logics of the 19th century as well, and pressed it towards a radical empiricist tradition. Mathematics, for example, he interpreted as an empiricist enterprise, something very much at odds with the history that had preceded him. He's perhaps most famous as a social thinker. He did a book on liberty, which is one of the most famous defenses of liberty in the history of political philosophy. It is something which is upheld and defended by many people today, particularly libertarians, and it holds essentially that people are free and should be allowed to be free to do as they will, as long as it doesn't interfere with or harm others, a thesis that most Americans would find very congenial today. He was also an economist. He followed Adam Smith. He was very much a believer in the free market, although he was also very qualified in his belief that he would accept that particular economic system only so long as it could be shown to, in fact, improve the lives of everyone. He was also a precocious defender of women's rights. He was married to a remarkable woman, Harriet Taylor, and with her he penned a book called On the Subjection of Women, and in the 19th century he was certainly one of the most persuasive voices in terms of giving women the right to vote, in terms of giving women rights equal to men. In this lecture, what I'd like to talk about is his ethics, and in particular the moral philosophy which is usually called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral philosophy based on the principle that one should cause the most benefits and the least harm. It's often summarized in the popular slogan, the greatest good for the greatest number. Like virtually everything else in Mill's philosophy, it's based on solid empiricist considerations, because it's through experience that one sees what sorts of consequences follow from what sorts of actions, whether those consequences are in fact beneficial or harmful. Mill's philosophy is summarized in a pamphlet he published called Utilitarianism, and it's really that pamphlet which I'm going to be summarizing in the lecture to follow. The first thing to say is that Mill didn't invent utilitarianism. In fact, it's a feature of British moral philosophy. One can trace it back at least to David Hume, who argued that ethics should be based on what he called utility. One might also point to Hume's friend, Adam Smith, who, in addition to his economic theories, also had a series of moral theories in which utility played a central function. The most important figure in this particular history is Jeremy Bentham, who preceded Mill by a generation or so. It was Bentham who invented what he called the happiness calculus, according to which one could actually sit down and figure out what the best course of action was according to the amount of pleasure it caused, the amount of harm it caused, and what's more, the number of people to whom the pleasure and harm were done. One could also figure out, on the basis of such a calculus, the percentage, the proportion, the probabilities of certain acts causing pleasure or, on the other hand, causing harm. He talked about, for example, proximity, whether the harm or pleasure caused would be very nearby or rather further along down the line. We could talk about the probability of an act causing harm or pleasure, and so on. But Bentham sought to reduce ethics to a kind of science. The idea was that it wasn't a matter of speculation, it wasn't a matter of depending on God's will, which could be interpreted in many different ways. It wasn't a matter of using reason alone, but rather, again, it was a matter of experience. Bentham's own concern was the reform of the still rather barbaric British penal system. These are the days when people were still hanged for stealing a loaf of bread to feed their starving families. And what Bentham argued essentially was that punishment should fit the crime in the precise sense that it should inflict just enough pain to offset the pleasure that would be gained by the crime itself. He then generalized this theory into a view about ethics in general, and utilitarianism, now properly so called, was its result. The most immediate influence on Mill, however, was his father. James Mill was a friend, associate of Bentham, and he taught Mill the philosophy of utilitarianism at a very early age. But it is Mill, with his great writing abilities, with his general education, who really made the most persuasive case altogether. I said it's largely a British tradition, but one should point out that it certainly did spread elsewhere. For example, in France, Voltaire, who had visited England, took utilitarianism very seriously and often used it in his reformist activism. In Germany, on the other hand, utilitarianism never caught on. Kant, Hegel, and especially Nietzsche, to name the three most famous, thought that it was simply a vulgar philosophy. To talk about utility was to completely miss the importance of morality, which had a much higher calling, or in the case of Nietzsche, perhaps a much sneakier calling, but nevertheless, utility was not what it was all about. There's a sense in which utilitarianism is perfectly suited to the 19th century. It is particularly appropriate, for example, to commercial society. And the Industrial Revolution was already well underway. The society, which contained a good, solid middle class of bankers and shopkeepers and so on, was well in place in England. And when you think about the requirements of utilitarianism, namely that you should calculate harms, you should calculate benefits, what is easier to calculate than financial harms and benefits? And I think you can sort of say of utilitarianism, this is the beginning of what we now call cost-benefit analysis, the idea that everything can be converted to some single currency, and I use that term here metaphorically, but the metaphor very quickly becomes literal because currency can be converted to money, which is the currency of modern society. In Bentham, this was taken quite literally in the sense that when you calculate this happiness calculus, when you try to figure out exactly what the probabilities are of harm and benefits, the number of people the number of people affected, and so on, what you do is you take a straight quantitative measure. One of the problems that Mill is going to see with Bentham's notion is that it's not at all clear whether pure quantitative calculations is going to capture the sort of thing that he wants. You can count the number of people, you can take the amount of pleasure and pain, you can measure in proximity and likelihood and so on, but still Mill felt very strongly that something was missing. There's a question, for example, about distribution and fairness. It's all well and good to say that happiness or pleasure and pain, on the other hand, should be maximized according to the greatest good and the greatest number. But just to take a rather arbitrary notion, suppose enormous happiness or enormous pleasure accrues to people who perform some particularly cruel or unfair activity to some very small minority, where one could calculate that the pleasure gained by the oppressors actually outweighs the pain suffered by the victims. What can utilitarianism say about that? And it's not clear. With response to the question of, for example, human rights, Bentham had the rather sarcastic answer, the notion of rights is nothing but nonsense on stilts. It didn't enter into his calculations at all. But on the other hand, the idea of utility, the idea of utilitarianism as the maximization of pleasure, the minimization of pain, led to one very important consequence, in Bentham in particular, and that is a kind of new consideration about animal welfare. Animals were pretty much left out of philosophy for a good deal of its history. The idea that animals had anything like rights, or in utilitarian terms, considerations that we should give them in terms of their suffering, really had been ignored pretty much altogether. What Bentham says is that it doesn't much matter whether or not an animal can think. The question is whether it can suffer. Because in a good deal of philosophy, notably, for example, in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, a person's moral status was largely predicated on rationality, on ability to think, the ability to deliberate, the ability to recognize right from wrong. But what Bentham is saying is that animals, because they can suffer, and presumably they can also feel pleasure, deserve a certain kind of consideration too. And the animal rights movement dates back to that time. And just to name one very contemporary philosopher, I would note Peter Singer is very much a person who follows Bentham in precisely this pursuit of the greatest happiness for the greatest number of animals. Mill's utilitarianism, on the other hand, while it shared the basic premise of Bentham's philosophy, nevertheless went beyond it in several crucial respects. Most importantly, Bentham's idea of a quantitative calculus, a way of calculating the amount of harm, the amount of benefits, is something that, as I said, he found greatly lacking. It doesn't take any account of notions of fairness. It doesn't take any account of the idea of fair distribution. But more important in terms of Mill's own upbringing and education, it seems to treat all pleasures just the same, differing only in their quantity. But there's a very real problem, because there are pleasures that we would consider vulgar. There are other pleasures that we wouldn't consider highly desirable. For example, Bentham, referring to a rather trite game of his time, said that pushpin is as good as poetry. Today's terms, bowling is just as good a pleasure as philosophy. Not to knock bowlers, but one wants to nevertheless make a certain distinction here, that there are pleasures which are of a higher quality than others. And so what Mill introduces into his philosophy is the idea of the quality of pleasures. He says, for example, much better a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. The distinction he makes, he thinks, can be defended on objective grounds. One might be tempted to say, well, look, pleasure is pleasure, and the pleasure belongs to he or she or it who has it. But the truth is, when he considers, for example, the pig example, one might note that pigs get great pleasure rolling around in the mud. Socrates takes great pleasure, in a way, tormenting himself with very difficult philosophical pleasures. On what grounds, then, could one possibly say that Socrates' pleasures are of a higher quality than the pig's pleasures? And Mill has the following answer. The pig has never experienced Socratic pleasures. The pig has never done philosophy. The pig doesn't know the joy of working through philosophical quandaries, whereas Socrates knows both sets of pleasures and chooses what he considers the higher. There's a difficulty with this, and I think most of you can already figure it out, and that is, it's pretty doubtful that Socrates ever did, in fact, enjoy pig-type pleasures. Whether Socrates ever did rolling in the mud or some equally vulgar activity, I have no idea. But he certainly didn't do it as a pig. He did it as a philosopher. So there's a genuine sense about whether the pig and the philosopher are, in fact, in a position of being measured, of being compared. This leads to a general question about commensurability. How do we know that one person's pleasure is as great as or less than another person's pleasure? How do we know that the quality of a pleasure in one person is as great as or less than another person's pleasure? It also raises the question about what exactly utilitarianism is about. I've been talking pretty loosely about pleasures and pains. But of course, Mill more often talks about happiness, trying to get away from the hedonism that Bentham talked about. But is happiness really what we want to say either? How do you measure people's happiness? How do you know what makes people happy? And so some of the suggestions that more recent authors have put forward is that what utilitarianism is really about is about interests and whose interests are served or whose interests are harmed. Or also preferences, whose preferences are served, whose preferences are harmed. So there's a very real problem about how we're going to talk about utilitarianism, whether we're going to be thinking of it in terms of happiness, pleasure, and pain, whether we're going to be thinking about it in terms of interests, whether we're going to be thinking about it of preferences, and in any case, how we're going to measure, compare, find commensurability among these and between different people, or even more difficult, between different cultures. Mill rests his utilitarianism on two principles. The first is what he calls the principle of utility. It's pretty much just what we've been talking about. It's the principle that always act for the sake of the greater good, always act for the sake of maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. But this has to be coupled with another principle, which he calls the principle of equality. As he puts it, following Bentham, this means that each person should count as one and only as one. Utility can be summarized as the greatest good for the greatest number. Equality can be summarized as equality, as every person counts just for one, which means that no one, no matter what their status, their place in society, no matter what their interests, have any special place for gaining more benefits or avoiding more pain than anyone else. It is, at least on the face of it, a very democratic, egalitarian philosophy. Again, one can look at a contemporary philosopher like Peter Singer, who adopts much of this and uses it to come up with some rather shocking conclusions with regard to current affairs and ethical problems, things that perhaps Mill and Bentham never would have imagined. For example, the question of abortion, which in one sense has lingered since ancient times, but with modern medical technology has now become, medically at least, a matter of routine. The question is abortion moral? And of course, there are some very strong opinions about that on both sides. But Singer's view, capturing Bentham and Mill's utilitarianism, is basically this. It's a question of how much benefit, how much happiness will be enjoyed by the child that's born to a mother, even though perhaps it's unwanted. How much harm will be caused if an unwanted child comes into the world, both in terms of harm to the child, both in terms of harm to the mother's family or friends, and harm perhaps to people affected by the child later on. This gives a clue about some of the complications here, because when we're talking about the consequences of action for utilitarianism, they can stretch indeed very far into the future, and it's often very difficult, certainly at the time of making a decision, to figure out exactly what those consequences are going to be. Nevertheless, Singer's own solution, namely that there are cases in which abortion is clearly justified, has caused howls of protest in New Jersey in particular, where he now teaches. Or to take a different example, perhaps even more difficult to stomach, but not nearly so controversial in that sense. Singer points out that if you look at the amount of suffering and starvation in the world and compare it with the rather luxurious lifestyles of even middle-class Americans, what becomes clear according to the equality principle, the one counts only as one principle, is that most of us have an obligation to give away most of what we have so that we can feed the poor and cure disease and take care of people who are now seriously suffering in other countries. Singer himself, I should say, is an exemplar of this. Mill himself was also very much a philosopher who lived according to what he said. But I think a very real question for all of us is, to what extent can we buy into this philosophy if, in fact, it's going to cost us perhaps half of our income and holdings? The question of fairness that I mentioned is a very difficult one. How is happiness to be distributed? As I said, it might be that the happiness of a very small number of people might be so great that it would outweigh small miseries among a larger number of people. Or the happiness of a number of people, a large number of people, might be such that it would more than overwhelm the misery of a small number of people. And people who have attacked utilitarianism have often said, what's to prevent a sadist who gets enormous pleasure from torturing others to be justified according to the utilitarian principle, if in fact his pleasure is such that it outweighs the suffering that is caused to his victims? Now, Mill, I think, has an answer to this, and in the last part of utilitarianism has a very elegant discussion of justice and more generally of virtue. When he talks about justice, the question is always, can the principle of utility, coupled with the principle of equality, give us what we desire in terms of fairness, justice? The answer often given is no, it can't, because all utilitarianism looks at is cumulative harm, cumulative benefit. It doesn't look at the particulars of the case, whereas justice, in an important sense, must look at particulars. But here I think we can bring in Mill's important work on liberty, because there, when he discusses the importance of individual freedom, I think one of the things that he makes very clear, as opposed, for example, to his earlier contemporary, to his predecessors, Bentham and his own father, is the importance of what we would call rights. Mill doesn't talk much about rights as such, but it's pretty clear that what he says on liberty, that each person should have maximal freedom so long as they cause no harm to others, is very much a defense of what people today would, without any embarrassment, defend as a theory of human rights. In terms of the idea of justice, one might say that Mill always tempers what he considers as the crude utilitarian calculations of Bentham with considerations of quality. So one might say, for example, that it may give the sadist great pleasure to torture innocent people. Nevertheless, the quality of that pleasure is really on a very low scale. Whereas the quality of, for example, the pleasure that one gives, the pleasures that one gets giving away money to charity are pleasures on a very high scale, and to simply talk about harms and benefits here is only to give half the story. In fact, I would say that when it comes to the last part of utilitarianism and Mill's discussion of such topics as justice and virtue, he comes out not so much to be a real utilitarian, but something more of an Aristotelian. When he compares Bentham's view, the idea of quantitative calculation, with his own, which emphasizes quality, one of the problems that one might point to very quickly is the fact that if you look at pure quantity, then one of the scientific aims of utilitarianism, namely to have a clear, unbiased, objective way of calculating out what one ought to do, at least it makes a certain amount of sense, because one can simply take harms, benefits, somehow quantify them, although that's a problem, as I said, and figure out what the best result would be. But if you introduce a dimension of quality, then there's a very real problem, because after all, if you have a very enormous pleasure from some vulgar activity, and you have a modest pleasure from some rather ethereal activity, say studying philosophy, how do you compare those? It's sort of like comparing basketball scores and baseball scores. The scales are so completely different. How can you tell on the basis of these very different dimensions what the overall decision should be? And I think the conclusion that I draw is that Mill wasn't very serious about this scientific aspect of utilitarianism, but rather he was much more concerned with what Aristotle referred to as the virtues and the general sense of fitting into a society in a congenial way. Utilitarianism is a part of this. It certainly is a very good rule of thumb in terms of how to think about what you should do and what the consequences of what you will do will be. But to care about what those consequences are requires more than simply an objective view about pleasure and pain. It also requires, for example, a sense of what's good for people in some larger sense. It also involves a very strong sense of education, something that Mill was very involved with. It does involve questions of fairness, as evidenced by his involvement with women's liberation and so on. And it involves virtue in particular in the sense that what ultimately gives pleasure is the sense that one is a good person. When Mill in utilitarianism talks about what he calls the ultimate sanction, what he really has in mind is something that we would call conscience. The idea that when you act wrongly, you feel lousy. When you act correctly, you feel not necessarily self-righteous, but in any case, you feel good about it. Now there's an awkward fit between this kind of Aristotelian notion, with its emphasis on virtue, and his political liberalism, and in particular, the economics that he defended. But the truth is, Mill saw this awkwardness and took some pains to try and make it all work out. In particular with economics, as I mentioned before, he defended laissez-faire capitalism only insofar as it could be shown to establish the greatest good for the greatest number. He was well aware of the dangers of, for example, an increased split between the well-to-do and those who are badly off. He was well aware of the dangers of the absence of social controls on economics. But he maintained, at least until his death, the faith that all of this could be worked out. Nevertheless, towards the end of his life, he turned more and more towards what I think we would call socialism, because he became acutely aware of the fact that if we were to hold on to the basic utilitarian concept, the idea that utility should guarantee the greatest good for the greatest number, and that people should be treated equally so that the benefits of society should be more or less equally distributed, then it became more and more clear to him that simple laissez-faire capitalism wasn't going to do the job. So, should we believe in Mill's utilitarianism? I would argue that even in the crude form defended by Bentham, utilitarianism provides a very important corrective to the kind of self-righteous, a priori philosophizing and moralizing that had preceded. People who appeal to God's will, for example, are very often at odds about what God's will actually is. But what they all share in common is the fact that they're absolutely belligerent that this is the way it must be. Utilitarianism says, well, wait a minute, let's look. Let's see what actually does help people. Let's see what does actually harm people. So too for customary morality, morality that has been handed down generation to generation. Very often there's a good deal of wisdom contained therein, and in any case there are probably traditions that are worth maintaining. But there's also a lot of junk, and we certainly know many cultures, including our own, where things that are handed down from generation to generation are really just sanctions modes of cruelty. And here utilitarianism again provides a corrective, because we can ask, well, yes, I know we've done that for 15 centuries, but can't we now rethink about the amount of harm it causes? Or maybe that was good back in the 8th century AD, but now, with modern technology, with increased lifespans, maybe what we thought then, and maybe what did serve the greatest good for the greatest number then, no longer serves the greatest good for the greatest number now. In fact, Mill, when he is challenged by people as defending a kind of atheistic conception of morality, has, I think, the very startling answer that there's no reason not to believe in God. But if you believe in God, the only thing you can believe is that because God loves us, because God cares about our welfare, that God himself is going to be a utilitarian too.